Avengers Endgame closed the door on a beloved chapter in the MCU, so today on Beyond the Screen we want to recommend to all you curious folk out there the most ideal viewing order for returning fans or even new viewers. We're specifically opting to go down the timeline order route here as opposed to personal preference, but feel free to leave your comments down below with your ideal viewing order. And with that, let's just jump right in. To begin, you should start with Captain America: The First Avenger. What better way to begin than with the introduction of our favourite captain, Steve Rogers. In The First Avenger he is introduced to us through flashbacks, transporting us back to World War II, as well as connecting the film to the major antagonistic threat known as Hydra. Now the only downside to watching this film first is that it already expects you to know who Nick Fury is, and to a lesser extent, Howard Stark as well. However, timeline wise, First Avenger makes the most sense to watch first. Next, let's jump over to one of the most recent releases, Captain Marvel. Now in a similar vein to our previous point, this movie can be viewed in a variety of different orders, but if we're sticking with timeline continuity, this is its correct location. We are introduced to the most powerful superhero in the MCU in this 90s throwback film. It is an origin story, and aside from a post-credit scene that alludes to Endgame, it almost could exist entirely on its own outside of the Marvel timeline. In the grander scheme of things, Captain Marvel would be the flashback before the Infinity Saga, and is more of a way to introduce an important character for later down the line. However, like I said, with the post-credit scene, it complicates things, considering it is taken directly out of Endgame, which requires you to know who all of the characters are, but alas. Next, we have Iron Man, the movie that started it all back in 2008. Iron Man introduced to us Tony Stark and the origin of his Iron Man suit, as well as Stark Industries and more importantly, S.H.I.E.L.D. Specifically, Agent Phil Coulson and the idea of the Avengers Initiative. Not only that, but this is also the film that began the post-credit scenes tradition. Next, Iron Man 2. We introduced to Rhodey, aka War Machine in Iron Man 2, a central figure in the MCU following this. It lays the groundwork for events to come, and more importantly gifts us with the introduction of Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow, one of the original 6. Next up, The Incredible Hulk. Don't watch it. Next we have Thor. This was the MCU's first foray into the cosmic elements of Marvel and introduced us to another one of the original 6, the Norse god of thunder, Thor. More importantly still, we are introduced to the Norse god of mischief, Loki, a prominent figure throughout the rest of the MCU. Next up, we have The Avengers, a movie like none other. A movie that brought together all of the MCU heroes, united against a common threat. This is also the first movie where we get to see Mark Ruffalo take on the role of the Hulk, replacing Edward Norton from that earlier film that I told you not to watch. Now the movie takes elements from the Ultimates comics, and introduced both mid-credits and end-credit scenes, and was arguably the first step towards Infinity War. Next up, Iron Man 3. This was the first movie from Phase 2, with Phase 1 concluding with Avengers. In this film we see Tony dealing with the personal aftermath of the events in Avengers, and introduces us to his greatest enemy. Well, kinda. Next up, Thor: The Dark World. This atrocious Thor sequel also deals with the aftermath of Avengers, much like our last point, only this time we have a new villain, Malekith and the Dark Elves. This film is only important because it has a direct connection with Thor Ragnarok, which we will be discussing later. Next up, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. In this film we see Cap and Black Widow team up together for S.H.I.E.L.D. in their counter-terrorist special mission unit Strike. Now this movie is incredibly important because it completely shakes up the MCU by introducing Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes, aka Steve Rogers' best friend from his days as a soldier. Next, Guardians of the Galaxy. Yes, the first full-on introduction of the cosmic side of Marvel, with Guardians of the Galaxy, introducing the likes of Star-Lord, Gamora, Nebula, Groot, Drax, and Rocket. During the mid-credit scene of Avengers, we are introduced to a big purple alien, who is finally named in Guardians. Yes, Thanos. Well done, kids. Now, the movie's story is pretty much a standalone in the grand scheme of things, with the most important piece of information coming out of it being Thanos. Next, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and they're back again, and not much has changed. Once again, it doesn't have any real ties to the broader MCU, allowing you to watch it whenever you want. But what better placement than right after the first one? Next, Avengers: Age of Ultron. At this point, the Avengers are now an established team. However, when Tony makes a big goof and creates an evil sentient robot, the Avengers must team up again to take down this big threat. Now, this movie sets up a number of things heading into Phase 3, and of course introduces us to Scarlet Witch. Up next, Ant-Man. Now this movie is the conclusion of Phase 2 and the perfect film to follow Age of Ultron. We are introduced to Scott Lang, a criminal who is approached by Dr. Henry Pym to protect his greatest inventions, Pym particles, which are very important leading into the latter half of our list, and particularly Endgame. Next up, Captain America Civil War. The third installment of Captain America not only brings us Steve, but also the entire Avengers gang, only this time they're battling each other. The story deals with the fallout of the events in Age of Ultron, as well as deals with the introduction of Winter Soldier from the previous film. However, more importantly, we get Spidey-Man. Next, Doctor Strange. Yes, the first film that fully introduces the mystic arts into the MCU, as well as introduces alternate dimensions, an immensely important aspect that will come into play later on. Now it's hard to place the film considering it takes place over a long stretch of time, however it's the perfect introduction to Doctor Strange, who plays a huge role in the MCU from this point onwards. Next, Black Panther. This film picks up right after the events of Civil War, with T'Challa returning home and taking on the mantle of king. Now, the film itself doesn't tie in too much to the rest of the MCU, but it is instead a fitting origin story for a hero in a setting that we will get to see later on down the line. Next up, Spider-Man Homecoming. Spidey is back and now adjusting to life as a superhero, flying around New York and solving petty crimes. We can assume it takes place just a few short months after the events of Civil War, and gives us the Spider-Man origin story we all desperately needed. Also, Tom Holland. Coming up next, we have Thor Ragnarok. This film takes place well after the events of Age of Ultron, and sees both Hulk and Thor on an adorable cosmic adventure. Now, the film alone is fantastic and leaves behind Bruce Banner with us watching on as Hulk takes front and center. However, more importantly, the post-credit scene leads directly into the events of Avengers Infinity War. Next up, Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, Ant-Man and the Wasp takes place roughly a few weeks prior to Infinity War, with the most important aspect moving forward being the quantum realm, as well as the post-credit scene, which shows a lot of the characters get dusted, while Ant-Man is trapped inside of the quantum realm. Here we go, our final two. We have Avengers Infinity War. We honestly don't need to explain this one for you guys, it's the big showdown between the Avengers and Thanos, who has his sights set on the Infinity Stones, with the movie ending with the Mad Titan snapping and dusting half of the universe. And of course, finally we have Endgame. This really needs no explanation. This is the final chapter in Phase 4 and closes the book on a lot of our favourite heroes that were previously mentioned. Now I'm not going to spoil anything for you, just watch it. Well, there we have it. Do you guys agree with our viewing order, or do you disagree? Leave us all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below. If you haven't already, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another Beyond the Screen vid. And until next time, see you later.